Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. This is the kickoff event for Expanding Empathy 2025 here out of Penn State University. I am Daryl Cameron. I run the Consortium on Moral Decision Making here at Penn State and the Empathy and Moral Psychology Lab. This is the 7th year, I've realized, of this Expanding Empathy speaker series, the theme of which is to bring people together from all over the world to talk about empathy, ethics, moral psychology from different disciplinary perspectives. Over the years, we've cultivated a lot of really interesting conversations and dialogues about what empathy is, how is it important for moral life and social life, and in what way. How do we think about empathy in artificial agents and animals and clinical cases? And I think that today's kickoff session will be really fascinating in thinking about how we think about what empathy is, how we study it, measure it, and examine it across a range of social interactions. Before I forget, the consortium is, if you're interested, it's moralconsortium.psu.edu. It's an interdisciplinary network of social scientists and philosophers based at Penn State, but also around the world who study these topics. And the goal of which is to think about high risk, interesting, intriguing, fun collaborations at the intersection of different social, scientific, and humanities disciplines to get us outside of our silos, so to speak. We're supported by the College of Liberal Arts, the Psychology Department, the Philosophy Department, the Rock Ethics Institute, which is where the series started, where I'm also a part of, the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, the Social Science Research Institute. There are a lot of fun, fascinating, sharp, and bright groups here at Penn State that want to cultivate these conversations. And before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say, I think right now, especially as we think about what empathy is and how it can be used in society, what is it? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? I think it's really important for us to really dig deep and think about what empathy is and how it works. So let me go ahead and introduce the two speakers for today. The format, for those of you who are new to this, the format is that each speaker will take about 35 to 45 minutes or so giving a talk on their independent lines of research. There'll be a little bit of Q&A after each talk, but then we really want to set aside a good chunk of time at the end for people to for the speakers to talk to each other. If you have any questions throughout the talks or later on, just drop them in the Q&A at the bottom. As a webinar format, that's the way to interact with our speakers. And so if you have any questions, I'll monitor that and we'll try to curate as we go along. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So Dr. Phillip Kanske is a professor and chair of clinical psychology and behavioral neuroscience at TU Dresden in Germany, and research associate at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences. I've been following Dr. Kanske's work for a long time. He studies the interactive, emotional, and cognitive mechanisms that help people have social interactions, including things like empathy, mentalizing, emotion regulation, especially how these play out in terms of psychopathologies, studying interventions. In his work, he uses a wide range of methods, including behavioral science tools from psychology, ecological momentary assessment, physiology, functional neuroimaging. He's published in some of the field's top journals, like Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, with work on empathizing and mentalizing, also the Journal of Neuroscience on decoding the charitable brain, and on emotion regulation in the journal Cerebral Cortex. He received the Association for Psychological Sciences Rising Star Award in 2013 and a Young Investigator Award from the European Brain and Behavior Society, and the Heinz Meyer-Leibniz Award from the German Research Foundation in 2017. And most recently, in 2023, impressively, he received an ERC Consolidated Grant for a project titled Interact, the Interplay of Neural Networks Enabling Social Interaction. So I'll introduce Dr. Berio before her talk a little bit later on. But yeah, pleased to have you here, Dr. Kanske. And whenever you're ready, please go ahead and take it away.
Let me say thank you first for inviting me. It's a really impressive program I think you have, and also like over the years, and also for an impressive consortium. And I'm deeply honored to be invited and present my work here. So this is all work by many people, of course, I want to say up front, and I'm very thankful to them, and you'll see some of them throughout and towards the end also. All right, so let me get started directly. I'll start with a big long-term study, the Framingham Heart Study that tested over 10,000 people over a long period of time, more than 32 years. You can see all the people in this little network here on the right. So many of them were connected to each other in some way. And what they looked at is how, among many things, is depression and how it develops across time. And what they found is that your depression level or the depression level of one of the participants would rise if at a previous point in time, one of their social network nodes, basically, like someone who they were connected to, felt depressed. And the more people in their network were depressed, the more likely you were to later on also be depressed. And this is strongest for the people you are directly in contact with, but also still significant for people one node or two nodes distant from you. So that's quite interesting. I think that it even jumps basically across these nodes. So what this kind of would allude to is that something like depression is a contagious thing or can spread in networks. Is that the case or not? But it interestingly shows also that yeah, our social networks and our social relationships may even pose a danger in some circumstances, right? They may make us more vulnerable to become depressed in some instances. On the other hand, I want to show some data that we collected during the COVID pandemic. This is work by Annika Conrad in the lab. And what she did is basically over the period of a longer period of time, ask people continuously about their psychological distress levels. And what we see is that people who had a previous diagnosis of a mental disorder in blue here, that their distress levels were continuously higher than those of people who never had a diagnosis of a mental disorder. Now, this time period here, it starts in the strict lockdown period here in Germany. And then there was a transition phase when the measurements were eased out and you could go out more and more and meet people more and more. And across that period, pretty much everybody in the group showed a decrease in psychological distress levels. So these are the people unaffected of a mental health disorder and irrespective of their social resources. Here we have three groups with high, low, and medium social resources. All of them decrease in social stress or in psychological distress over time. And for the people with a mental disorder in the past, what we see is that people who are really low in social resources, they don't show this decrease. So what we can say here is that social resources kind of buffer distress and can really help you in especially these particularly vulnerable groups. People with a mental disorder can help you to decrease stress levels. So our social networks are also really important for us and help us to buffer stressors. So what this all means is that I think that it's very worthwhile to study how we build up and maintain social relationships that are helpful for us. And social neuroscience has looked at these functions for a long time already and has studied all kinds of different social functions like social attention, face perception, person perception, and also theory of mind and empathy. And these are the two I want to focus on today. Why is that? Let me first define how I use the terms in this talk now. Theory of mind would be the reasoning about others' intentions, goals, and emotions also. It's an abstract reasoning about the other states, and it yields, therefore, propositional knowledge of the other state. Empathy, on the other hand, would be the sharing of others' emotions. This doesn't lead to abstract knowledge about that state or that affective state of the other, but to an isomorphic, like the same shape, isomorphic effect in the observer. Why is it interesting to focus on these two? I think in contrast to the other social functions that I showed you earlier, what they allow is a representation of other people's inner mental states. And knowing about the other's inner mental states may be really particularly important when we think about the critical moments in social relationships. When you have conflict with someone, for instance, when stress is high and so on, being able to overcome your own perspective and being able to also understand the perspective of the other could be particularly important. Okay, now both of these functions have been investigated already for a long time over the years. Empathy, for instance, has been studied with, I just collected a few types of paradigms that people have used. For a very common one is where you see body parts in pain, for instance, pricked by a needle here. Or here you see someone taste something very disgusting. But there are also a bit more complex tasks like this one where you see a person and apparently the father of that person and this person apparently failed a test, and you are now to deduce kind of what's going to happen next and how will the people feel in this instance. So this is a bit more complex here. And for theory of mind, there's a long research tradition also, for instance, with these false belief tasks, where different characters have beliefs about the reality. For instance, where a ball is, you probably all know the Sally Ann task, Sally and Ann, the two dolls here, and the child or the participant who does the task, is supposed to understand that a doll can have a wrong belief about where the ball might be. Another often used task is these hide and simulations where geometric shapes behave or they move around in a biological meaningful way, and you cannot really help but assign mental states to these geometric shapes. So like one teasing the other, for instance. And then one that is also used quite a lot is the reading the mind in the eyes task, where you just to say what effect might be displayed in this eye region that you see here. And we've gone along together with Matthias Schutz and wanted to systematize all these tasks a little bit. And what we did in the first step is to try to sort them into task groups. So what we found is that there are a couple of task groups that are typically used for theory of mind, for instance, the false belief task, but also trait judgments, for instance. And then there are typical empathy tasks like observing pain, like this one, observing emotions or pain, sharing, being explicitly instructed to share emotions, or also these bit more complex tasks like reasoning about others' emotions. And now finding out about how do all these different ways to assess these supposedly similar functions, how do they relate to each other, and also how do these functions relate to each other? It's difficult to do if you just have behavioral data here. This is one of the instances where neural data actually is really helpful, because what you can do is you can look at the activation patterns in the brain for each of these task groups, and then look at similarity and dissimilarity of these activation patterns. And this is what we did. So in the first step, we did meta-analyses for each of these task groups. Here you see the task groups again, and now I'm going to show you a lot of different brains. These are 11 different meta-analyses for each of these different task groups. You can see some similarities. So for instance, for the theory of mind task, you most of the time have this temporoparietal junction activity. You also have these very anterior and posterior midline activations, but you also see that there are some differences. And the same for empathy. For most of these tasks, you have anterior insular activation, for instance, and also this dorsal anterior cingulate, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex activation, but there are also differences here. And now we used a meta-analytical hierarchical clustering analysis to really determine which of these based on these activation patterns, how do these different task groups and the concepts they are supposed to measure, how do they relate to each other? What it gives you is such a dendrogram like this. And what you can now see is basically the task like these false belief tasks. This would be the false belief task is very similar to the trait judgments, where you're supposed to judge traits of other people. The activation patterns these two types of tasks elicit are very similar. And that's why they're close together here. And if you're further away, then the task activation patterns are more dissimilar. And you can now use different statistical measures to determine how many clusters are make sense in the data. And a 3-cluster solution seems to be very good at capturing a lot of variance here. And this would look like this. When you map basically the 3 task groups that fall in this one cluster, on the brain, you get these activations. Again, you see temporoparietal junction, anterior posterior midline regions. We termed this the cognitive cluster because it really includes these task groups that are supposed to measure theory of mind and yeah. And on the other hand, we also see another cluster where we have this anterior cingulate, anterior insular, and also anterior cingulate cortex activations that you can see here. In this cluster, we have observing pain, sharing emotions of others, observing emotions of others. Interestingly, also the reading the mind in the Eins task, which is supposed to be a theory of mind task, but if you think about it, it's emotional eye regions that you actually see that you are stimulated with. So in terms of the activation pattern this task elicits, it's actually more close to the affective tasks. And so we call this the affective cluster. And now, interestingly, there is a third cluster here. When you look at this third cluster, what you can see is that it's not entirely different brain regions that are activated, but it seems to be more a combination of the regions that we see here and here. So we have the anterior insula, for instance, that we see in the affective cluster, but we also have these temporoparietal junction regions that we see in the cognitive cluster. And we did a whole bunch of different types of analyses to find out more about this intermediate cluster. And what we can really say is that it really does seem to be a combination of the other two clusters, not like a very different thing. And when you look at the tasks that are in this cluster, then these are the bit more complex tasks, like reasoning about others' emotions. Or there are also tasks where you're supposed to deduce what someone's going to do next based on an emotional state a person has. So tasks where one could assume, like based on the thinking about the task, both functions are kind of triggered or necessary to solve the task. And then you also seem to get activation in both tasks. So we can separate these functions based on the neural activation patterns. And if that is the case, then of course it will also be interesting to be able to assess both functions in one individual, right? To be able to see whether they're, how dependent or independent they are within people, if they are selective impairments, for instance, also or selective developments. And so in the next step, I would like to show you a task that we developed to assess both functions. We termed it EmpaTOM because it's supposed to measure empathy and theory of mind. And the way it works is that participants are presented with a name, Anna in this case. Then you see a short video, about 15 seconds. And the video comes in different flavors. It can be either neutral or emotional. What happens in the video is that this person tells you a brief story allegedly from their life. So it can be something like, I went to the movies with some friends and we had pizza afterwards. It was an evening that I liked for the neutral one, for instance. And for the emotional one, it could be things like talking about serious mental illness that close person, like a close one has, for instance, close relative or so, or other things that are highly emotionally negative. We only focus on negative emotions here. And our idea was that if after these emotional videos, you say that you feel a bit more negative yourself, you empathically share the emotional state of the person in the video. And this is actually what we found. So after the emotional videos, people rate their own emotional state to be more negative than after these neutral videos. And this goes along with activation in regions that are now already familiar to you, including the anterior insula, for instance, on both sides. And interestingly, this network is not only active when we contrast the emotional with the neutral videos, but also when we look at when we use a parametric modulation analysis, basically look at which regions in the brain co-vary individually with the ratings that you give after each video. So it may be that one story touches you a lot, another doesn't, and which regions in the brain track these individual ratings. And this is basically the same regions that you see here. Also, we put that here in yellow, and since it mostly overlaps, you can see that it's here overlapping mostly with the network where we contrast the conditions. All right, now the task goes on. At a later point here in the task, we ask participants a question about the video. And there are also two types of questions. The one that interests us most is a theory of mind question. This would be a multiple choice question where we ask about the thoughts of the person in the video. So some videos are made in a way that the people hint at something that they might think about a certain situation, but they don't explicitly say it. And then we ask, what do you think Anna actually meant? And as a control condition, we have a factual reasoning task here where you also need to remember the events mentioned in the video and also need to make a reasoning, but it's not about the mental state of the person, it's about worldly things. So for instance, if you say that you went to college in Pennsylvania, for instance, then maybe you can deduce that probably this person went to high school at some point in their life and finished high school. Okay, now what do we see when we contrast these theory of mind questions with the factual reasoning questions? I put that here in green. And as you can see, it's a different network, but it's also one that is familiar to you now. We see the temporal parietal junction, for instance, and these temporal region, also these anterior and more posterior midline regions. Now, an interesting side note here is that this network is not only active for the questions, but already during those videos that lead to a theory of mind question. So the videos that where people only hint at something, participants already activated this network despite not yet knowing what type of question they would get and also not knowing what specific question they would get. So to some degree, this network spontaneously activates when someone is telling you something where you have to make some deduction about what they actually think. Now, I wanted briefly to talk about this task for one slide more and tell you a bit about how we validated it. Because we also wanted to use it in longitudinal study, there are now 5 parallel sets of this task, and the empathy condition includes really a wide variety of different situations: traffic accidents that happened, involuntary pregnancy, partnership problems, diverse somatic and mental diseases, and disorders, betrayal and guilt, political violence, and so on. And this allows us to do an item analysis. You might be familiar with item analysis from linguistics or from behavioral studies, but there's also a way to do it with fMRI data, and it allows you basically to generalize from the population of situations or from the sample of situations you have in your study to the population of these situations. And this is what we did. And here you can see the item-wise and the subject-wise analysis. Subject-wise is the one that you kind of saw already on the previous slide, but you can also see that it very much overlaps with the item-wise analysis. So there, basically, it replicates on an item level, the item-wise level, the results from the subject-wise analysis. And for theory of mind, there are also diverse theory of mind questions here, first and second order, true and false beliefs, preferences and desires, irony, sarcasm, metaphors, white lies, deception, and faux pas. And here we did the same type of fMRI item analysis, and you can see that, again, we can replicate the subject-wise with the item-wise analysis. There is now also an English version, 2 parallel sets, which replicates the neural activation patterns also in 7T. That was a 7T study. And there's also a German version now with an empatome version for youth aged 14 to 18, with a bit younger narrators, and the topics are also a little bit more appropriate for that age group. And that is currently being translated into English as well. All right. Now, given that we have both of these capacities now tested within this one task, it allows us to really relate them to each other. We can ask, is someone who is spontaneously sharing other people's emotions a lot, someone who is also really good at mentalizing, for instance, at theory of mind or perspective taking. I use those a little bit interchangeably. And so we correlated basically performance in our theory of empatome task and the theory of mind performance and also the valence ratings. And in this sample of about 180 people, we did not see a significant correlation here. When we combined performance in different empathy and theory of mind tasks, we also did not see a correlation. And the same goes for the neural activation patterns. In whatever way we do it and whatever time windows we choose, we don't see a significant correlation between these two functions. This was a bit surprising to us, and but also interesting, because it means that it doesn't mean that these functions never ever work together, but that they are separable, and that individual differences in one are not necessarily are not related to individual differences in the other. You're not automatically good in one if you're strong in the other, for instance. And this also means that there may be individual differences, selective impairments or changes in different groups. A recent study by Brandon McDonald in the lab looked at gender. What he found is across actually several studies that there is a small but significant gender difference in empathy. What we see that the neutral videos ratings here are not different, but for the emotional videos, female participants displayed here in yellow rate them to be a little bit, to experience them a little bit more negatively. There were no differences in theory of mind. And this was replicated in yet another study where Brandon saw exactly the same pattern of results. So for these gender differences, it seems like only empathy is affected by gender. I know these studies are a little bit difficult to interpret, and there may be a lot of cultural things going in here, but still, it's kind of interesting, I think, to see that one changes empathy in this case, the other doesn't. What we also see in a group of is that we tested a group of people with violent crimes in the past. These are people who have all committed bodily harm to other people and went to prison. And when they came out of prison, we tested them behaviorally so far. And what we see here is that for theory of mind, there were no significant differences, but we saw differences in the ratings for empathy. So these aggressive offenders rated to feel less negatively affected by emotional videos than the non-aggressive control participants here. Another group we looked at is people above an age of 65 years. What we see here is, interestingly, that compared to the younger adults on the left here, the older adults really show a reduced theory of mind performance. But interestingly, the theory of mind performance displayed in red is not as strongly declined as the factual reasoning performance displayed in yellow here. So the general cognitive decline you see in aging populations, which is, I think, caught more here with the factual reasoning questions, seems to be a little bit buffered maybe for the social cognitive functions. And for the affective side of things, empathy, we don't see any age differences at all. If at all, then older adults rate to feel with the other a little bit more strongly. And now recently, Julia Stietz in the lab replicated this result. Nicer graphs, but same story here. Julia has also looked at this with neuroimaging. And what she found is that in blue, you can see the theory of mind activations that we saw in the previous study. And what you can see is that there is an age differences in such that younger adults activate parts of this network a bit more strongly than older adults. So parts of the temporoparietal junction and this posterior midline region here were activated more strongly in young compared to old adults, going along with this behavioral decrease in theory of mind accuracy that we saw. And there were no differences in the empathy-related activations. And one last condition I wanted to show is an interesting risk factor for bipolar disorder, hypomanic personality. There are longitudinal studies on this personality trait. And if you rate high on questions like these, I think I would be a good nightclub entertainer, for instance, or I'm often so excited that friends ask me if I'm on drugs. If you rate high on these types of questions, then you are indeed more likely to, much more likely than people scoring low to develop a bipolar disorder later on. And what we saw in this group is that part of the theory of mind-related activations in this case, in the anterior midline, was related to the hypomanic personality scale score, while there were no relations to empathy here. So all of this is to say that we do see differential effects on these two functions. And to briefly summarize what I've said so far, I think we can say that these functions are dissociable. Meta-analytically, within tasks and subject, there's this non-correlation. And also in development and psychopathology, we do see a differentiation. Now, an interesting question is why we study these is also, of course, to relate it to social behavior and see whether these functions and how these functions influence social behavior. And so Konrad Lehmann in the lab did a study on pro-social behavior where he extended the task basically and added a pro-social rating. Would you be willing to help this person that you saw previously in the video? And what he saw is that people rate to be more willing to help the person after the emotional compared to the neutral trials. And this is also correlated. So within the emotional trials, the more you, for this particular story, were affected by the emotion of the video, the more likely you are to be willing to help. And there was no such association for the neutral videos. For theory of mind, interestingly, there was also a relation. What we saw here was that accuracy, so if you responded to this question accurately, did not matter in terms of prosocial decisions if it was a factual reasoning question. But for theory of mind, if you responded correctly to the question, then you were indeed more likely to also be willing to help that person. So if you understood the person correctly, then it means you're also more likely to help that person. The effect is much smaller than the effect here, but it's still significant. Brennan also found some gender differences here. He adapted the task a little bit and made it kind of here you actually had to give up some of your money. So what we told people is that we would donate some of the money to a charitable organization that is dedicated to the cause of the story that was mentioned. And so if a cancer story was told, for instance, then it would go to a organization supporting cancer victims. And what we saw here is that female participants again reported to or were willing to donate a little bit more than male participants. And now, interestingly, this was related to theory of mind in women, but there was no such relation for men, and also not for factual reasoning. So the relation of theory of mind understanding to prosocial decisions was really specific to women and theory of mind here. Okay, now I think I'm going to jump a little bit over this one study here. The gist of the story is that using the multivariate decoding, using the activation patterns observed for empathy and theory of mind in the anterior insula and temporoparietal junction allows you to actually also predict above chance if someone would be willing to donate to a charitable organization or not. It's a bit of a complex study, so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail here, but if you have questions later, please ask me. Okay, now the story seems so simple, but of course it's not. It gets a little bit more complicated because when you remember the first slide I showed you on depression being contagious, negative affect being shared and affecting observers cannot only be a good thing in some instances. And one such instance is, for instance, stress. This is a study done in a collaborators lab. Veronika Engert and Joost Blasberg did the study. What they used is the Trier social stress test. If you're not familiar with this test, you are supposed to give a little speech about yourself in front of this committee of people. And they are very angrily looking at you all the time, and you're filmed, and you see yourself in this grand mirror here. And what you usually see is an increase in cortisol in the people who undergo this stress test. So cortisol being the main stress hormone. This is a control condition here. Now, the interesting trick that we did here is to put someone else behind this one-way mirror. And if there is someone behind this one-way mirror watching you undergoing this stress, then the person behind the mirror who's not stressed themselves shares the stress. So there is a contagious, vicarious cortisol response also in the people watching behind the mirror. This is a strong effect in couples, for instance. And what Joost looked at here is mothers and their children. And so the children were behind the one-way mirror. And what they see is that subjectively, the children also share the stress. The red curve is the stress condition, the blue curve, the control condition. When looking at cortisol, you see a little bit the decline of cortisol throughout the day that you always see, and an interesting interaction with gender here. In this case, it's the boys only that seem to have a vicarious cortisol response. So it's a bit more complex, apparently, in the family systems. But what the gist of the story is that we also share other people's stress. This also happened during the pandemic in the study that I showed you already. Annika also looked at empathic disconnection, this kind of the opposite of empathy. So how much you can distance yourself from another person, how much you can disconnect really. And what we see is that disconnection doesn't affect people without a prior diagnosis of a mental disorder. But what you see here is that people high in empathic disconnection, so low in empathy, are showing lower response, psychological distress compared to the people high in empathic disconnection, so who share other people strongly and other people's emotions strongly. And Annika also looked at this a bit more nuancedly because conceptually we thought being able to empathically connect to someone else is really important in order to signal them, I'm understanding what you say. But of course, maybe too much can be too much at some point. And indeed, what Annika saw is that the quadratic trend explains the psychological distress best. So if you're mediate on this empathic disconnection scale, you actually show the least distress levels. And similarly, Annika also looked at the empatome task that I showed you earlier, and specifically at the activation during the video phase, and correlated it with the perceived stress scale. And so what she specifically looked at is the anterior insula activation. And again, here she found this U-curve pattern. So people showing very strong activation or very little activation in the anterior insula reported most stress, and people showing moderate levels of insular activation showed least stress if they were high in rumination. So it interacted with rumination here. Since this is about subjective stress across the last months, maybe it's related to that. So I think for now, what one can say is that there is some indication, at least, about this risky strength hypothesis, as it had been termed, that empathy can also be risky under some circumstances. And it may be interesting to think about, how can we actually achieve moderate levels or the right levels for someone of empathy. What we did with the empatome task is that we asked participants also to rate how much compassion they felt for the people in the video. We had to train this a little bit with participants, what we mean here exactly. In German, the words are even more confusing. So what we aimed at here is a positive emotion of care. It's also termed empathic care, empathic concern. So not necessarily how much you share the emotion of that person, but how much positive emotion you have. And there are studies showing that both can be there at the same time also. And what we saw in the empatome is that people after the emotional situations rate their compassion or empathic concern levels to be higher. And this goes along or co-varies specifically with activation in this striatum, which has often been related to positive affect and reward also. And when we look at prosocial ratings, also what we see is a really strong relation here. So the more compassion you rate, the more likely you are to say that you would be willing to help that person. And conceptually, we know that compassion and the networks it activates are strongly linked also to soothing responses throughout the entire body, mainly mediated also through the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the last thing I want to say is about how can we help people to achieve this? I'm going to say a few words about plasticity of these systems. Very short-term plasticity can be achieved by music. Brennan did a study where he added emotional and neutral music to these videos. So there's of course nothing like neutral music really, but music, this is basically music that people rate as less emotional than other music. And what we see here is that this has a specific effect. So emotional music only it doesn't affect the neutral videos depicted here in white, but it affects the ratings of the emotional videos such that emotional music makes the emotional videos even more emotional compared to the emotional videos without emotional music. The same goes for compassion and prosocial decisions even actually. So music affects even how willing you are to help the person later on in the trial, but there are no effects on theory of mind here. We also want to induce a little bit longer lasting changes, of course, not from changes from trial to trial. In a long-term training study where people trained in different modules for each of these modules went for 3 months. They trained in one module different perspective taking things. There was a meditation exercise where you always took a kind of a bird's eye perspective on your own thoughts, or in a dyadic exercise, took different perspectives on a situation you experienced in the last 24 hours. And as a listener, you would guess what perspective are you speaking from. And in the affect module here, you either did a loving kindness or compassion meditation or a dyadic exercise focusing on emotions and listening empathically. And what we see is that indeed this perspective training increases theory of mind performance compared to a passive control group here in blue, and also to this active control group, in our case, the affect training. And for compassion, we see also an increase in the compassion ratings in the empatome task, again, compared to this passive test-retest control group and to the perspective taking active control group. And this correlated even to structural changes in cortical thickness in the brain. The stronger your increase in cortical thickness in the anterior insula was after these 3 months, the more likely you were to report increased compassion after viewing these emotional videos after the affect training. And the more strongly cortical thickness in the temporoparietal junction increased, the more likely you were to respond correctly to the theory of mind questions after the perspective training. Change might also spread. I started with this network. Depression might spread, but also when we practice these things, there might be immediate effects, like the recipient might benefit in receiving help if prosocial actions increase after such a training, but also you might be prone to help others more. Cognitive functions and also emotional functions like implicit affect sharing and so on might also be affected. I'm going to be a bit fast here to briefly summarize again and say that now what we are currently working on in the lab is to look more at also how empathy and theory of mind influence each other, because we saw that they are active in the intermediate cluster, if you think of the meta-analysis in the beginning. And also, we know, of course, whatever you do is affecting the other, is changing the social situation. So it will also affect your empathy and theory of mind in an ongoing fashion. So we try to study these functions also in more realistic, naturalistic social interactions where people really face each other and are, talking about their actual events in an interactive setting. All right. With this, I want to thank everyone in the lab for helping us, the funding agency, the participants who participated, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you for a really fascinating talk. We have a couple questions in the Q&A, and anybody who online who has any questions, please feel free to drop some questions there. Um, I want to let me start with one question that we did get in the chat during your talk, and then I'll turn it to Leda, who I saw raised her hand as well. Um, so one of the questions was very early on. I think when you were when you were presenting on some of the clinical work to frame some of your talk at the very beginning. Micah asked if you ever saw correlations with death by suicide predictions. So this was very much at the very beginning of your talk, I believe. Micah, if you want, feel free to clarify your question further too, in terms of which correlate you're talking about there. Um, Perhaps while that's being, if you could just type your question into the chat, that would be ideal. Or follow up.
Yeah, so what I can say is that I don't know if that's the correct understanding of the question, but what we haven't done so far is to look at people with suicidal ideation and see whether their empathy and theory of mind levels, for instance, are different. Or an interesting question would also be how we empathize and take these people's perspective, right? So we haven't done that yet, but we are currently running a relatively large longitudinal study, or starting to run that with people with prior depression. And what we want to do, since it's a 2-year study where they have daily questions about their mood and so on, and we can track the mood, and we will call them up whenever an episode seems to come about. So what we kind of want to see whether we can, using, among other things, empathy and theory of mind, and being affected by other stress levels also in their close relationships, whether we can predict how often and under what circumstances an episode develops. And there we also ask about suicidal ideation and thoughts and suicide attempts even. And we want to catch those early on in the longer run, of course. And yeah, so I'll be able to talk about this in 2 years, maybe.
Great. And I think that's helpful. And Micah did follow up to clarify. They were referring to the contagious theory with depression, like the very beginning
Ah,
example.
I see. Yeah. So, yeah. So this, as far as I remember, the study's focus was not really depression. So I don't know how detailed they looked at the suicide also. So I only know now about this depression result that I reported on here. But that would, no. So I cannot really answer the question. Yeah, but you can check it up. The Framingham Heart study. It's a relatively big study with lots of publications. So.
Great. Um, so we had one other question during your talk, and then later we can have your question as well. So Brianna, one of our current students here, asked if the study that found gender differences, and I know you presented several different gender effects, but if in general, did the studies talk about mechanisms that underlie these differences? Do you think you would see differences across other social identities, such as race or class? And do you think that the mechanisms that underlie these differences would be similar across different marginalized groups?
Yeah. So I want to say that upfront that I was very careful to yeah, and discuss a lot with Brendan about whether we should really look at this, and because it's a little bit difficult to study this, since we had collected data from this task from really a lot of different studies, different circumstances, and we had relatively big samples. I thought it is a result that we can replicate, that we find a lot, so it's worth looking at it. But it's hard for me to say really something about where it comes from and what the mechanisms are. So this would be, we need to understand this a little bit better. A lot can be, these are all people in Germany, so a lot can be maybe due to cultural expectations, of gender, different genders, and what they entail and how people are raised and all that. So I'm by no means I want to say that it's due to biology, for instance. I just don't know. And so and similarly, I think culturally, there may be, stereotypes also for other groups, minorities or whatever group, and they might affect these things as well. There is now a collaborator of ours in the US who's actually looking at how cognitive load affects empathizing and theory of mind, specifically also looking at race, and wanting to see how whether you empathize with someone from your in-group or your out-group and so on, how that is affected also by cognitive load. So they don't have the results yet, and they're recording a new empatome, which is also always difficult with different ethnicities and so on. So it's a relatively long study, but yeah. Short answer, I cannot say anything about the mechanisms. Only that we know also from other studies that in-group and out-group certainly plays a big role. So we tend to empathize much more easily and strongly with in-group members than out-group members, irrespective of whether it's a minority or not.
Great. Well, so Leda, I saw that you had your hand raised at the very beginning of the Q&A. Did you want to pose a question to Philip?
I I do have some questions, but I can also ask them later during the plenary discussion, whatever is best for the flow.
We do have a couple of outstanding questions before we flip to your talk. Maybe we could save those for the plenary discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
So just looking, we have a few up here. I think one of them is from another former student. Lauren is asking about loneliness and if you think loneliness might associate with any of the effects you've seen in your studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly believe that actually. And what I can say is, for instance, that in the intervention study that we did, there is also a publication by someone else who was also on that large-scale intervention study. If you Google resource project, you might find it, that looked at how close do you perceive others and how close you feel to others and so on. And these daily exercises, so we had a third module also that was not social, but the two social modules here, they really affected that, and even immediately. So we had questions before and after each of these exercises, and especially the diets increased, for instance, feelings of connectedness to other people and so on. So the message here being, it's also not only, there's not only bad news about loneliness, there's also good news in the sense that I think it can be targeted with relatively easy exercises. So these dietic exercises, they're 10 minutes. People did it every day. We also tried it out ourselves to, a lot to pilot this, and they are fun. And yeah, there are easy ways to change this also a bit, I think.
Great. Yeah, I mean, certainly the social function of these different empathy components is fascinating to study. But the last two questions before we flip over to the next talk then. So Nama asks about aging and whether you mentioned the aging study, there was no differences, if understood correctly, in terms of empathy, but only in theory of mind. Do you think this would be associated with healthy aging neural changes? Would there be a similar different pattern for neurodegenerative conditions?
Yeah, so we see these relatively consistently across different samples now, this pattern, no changes in empathy. We also looked at compassion in this here, and compassion even seems to rise a little bit. So it's very clear that it's only in the cognitive domain that we see this deterioration with age, and we see it most strongly, like I said, for the factual reasoning than the atomic condition. So for social factors, there seems to be this buffer, which is interesting. And since we also see that it is related to reduced activation in the respective networks for theory of mind. So these networks were activated more strongly in younger compared to older adults. I would say, yes, that's probably due to, these networks also changing faster in aging in terms of volume, for instance. So this will have an effect on how well the functions carried out by these networks work. So when you look at neurodegenerative conditions, it would depend strongly on which regions in the brain are affected, I would say, and what the effects are really. Yeah.
And the last question is from anonymous attendee who's just asking about valence effects. So do you think, in terms of the empathy pro-social behavior correlation, do you think that would itself vary across positive and negative emotions?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. And empathy for positive emotion has been so understudied. But there are some studies showing that the mechanism seems to be the same, right? You activate networks that you also activate when you experience positive emotions yourself, like you do for negative emotions. So, and my guess would be, but it's really a guess that it increases. It would increase prosocial behavior. For the negative conditions here, I mean, or the way we set up the studies currently is that for the negative conditions really are about situations where there is some necessity for help, so or for need for help, I have to say. And so, if somebody just won the lottery and you're happy with them, you cannot really help them. But if there were, this might not indicate that they are currently in need of help, but you might still want to help them if there is something that they need help with. Yeah, and I would guess that you can see that if you set up a study where they somehow also need help still.
Great. So, yeah, I think one thing I'll return to in the plenary is especially, I'll save it for the plenary, but the variability across the empathy stimuli, both within the empathy set and the TOM set, was really interesting to me in thinking about cross-situational within-person differences and propensities to engage in these processes. As someone who really is interested in the empathy regulation and disconnection versus connection on a between and within-person basis, I think there's a lot of fascinating work there to examine. But I'll hold off asking you a ton of questions until the end. There's one other question from Daniel, and Daniel, will save your question for the plenary so that we can flip it over to our next speaker. So yeah, I'm pleased. So, the theme of expanding empathy is to bring together people from across psychology and neuroscience and philosophy. And so our philosophical speaker today works at the boundaries of philosophy and cognitive science. Leda Berio is a philosopher and cognitive scientist who studies social cognition, norms, philosophy of technology, another area of deep interest here for us in the consortium. She's a postdoctoral scholar at Ruhr University Bochum and also collaborates on the Communicative Mind project at the University of Warwick, I took a brief look at it, a really interesting interdisciplinary approach at how we think about theory of mind and language use in human adults, children, and non-human animals. She earned her PhD from Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf and published a book in 2021 called Talking About Thinking, Language, Thought, and Mentalizing. She's published on many topics in social cognition, moral psychology, and empathy. She has a forthcoming paper that looks really fascinating on reputational motives, virtue signaling, and mind shaping in philosophical psychology. She recently published on emotion attribution in the journal Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, and has published multiple papers on perspective taking and human robot interactions in several journals in philosophy and social robotics. So I thought, given your expertise, you seemed an especially insightful person to bring to these conversations. So without further ado, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. This is a great series, and yeah, I'm looking forward to your thoughts. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
And you can hear me well. Okay, good. Just one other moment. Okay, there you go. Perfect. Okay. I'm gonna set a timer so that I don't go over time. Yeah, thank you. Today I want to talk about empathy, social cognition, and artificial agents. And what I want to do is to take as a frame the idea of looking at how empathy and its subcomponents play out in our social interaction, and look in particular at interactions with artificial agents as an instrument, as a tool to look at the borders, the signature limits, and the underlying mechanisms of our empathic experiences. So what I will be doing will be have a talk divided in two. They will be different parts, but hopefully it will all come together. In the first part, I will focus on the question, what facilitates attribution of emotional states to artificial agents? And in the second part, I will focus on the other side. So how do affective interactions with artificial agents affect us? So we look at attribution first, and then our reactions when our emotions feel recognized. So starting with the first part, I will argue that looking at our interactions with artificial agents inform us on the presence of scripts and norms when it comes to emotional affective interactions and empathy. And I want to start from some phenomena that you might be already aware of. You most certainly are. So we know now, because of different studies in the last few decades and because of some things happening out there in the real world, so to say, that we do tend to attribute emotions, or at least explain our interactions with artificial agents and social robots in particular in terms of affective states, at least at times. So one of my favorite studies about this is this Lakatos study, where people were interacting with a robotic dog. And were explaining their own interaction with the dog in terms of emotional states. So trying to make the dog happy by choosing its favorite bowls and so on. But there are other studies, like the famous Rosenthal von der Putten study, where people were particularly resistant to watch the little Clio dinosaur robot suffering or expressing pain. Or very resistant to strike robotic bugs with a hammer, saying there was something wrong about that. So clearly being affected emotionally by the interaction. And there are cases out there where, for example, soldiers hold funerals for their own robotic companions when they got eliminated in battle, and so on. All of these interactions point to the fact that, at least at times, we do talk about our interactions with robotic agents and social robots in terms of emotional states, and we seem to behave accordingly. And this has been defined in the literature as a puzzle. So quoting directly from Clark and Fisher 2022 BBS paper, this behavior has been deemed self-contradictory, even irrational. They say people are willing to interact with a robot as if it was a social agent when they know it is a mechanical artifact, so pointing to the contradiction between these two things. And some explanations have been given. So Clark and Fisher, for example, propose that at the root of this phenomena is the fact that we feel for social robots because they are depictions of social agents. So what happens is we engage with a depicted layer, with a representation of a social agent, and our emotions are directed to the depicted level as well. So not to the robot, but to the representation. And according to other people in the literature, like Schmetkamp, for example, or Sayerson, we empathize and attribute emotions to robots the same way we do it with fictional agents or fictional characters. So the idea being there are representations of social agents, and that's why we engage with them. And I don't think these explanations are necessarily wrong. I think they get something right. But I want to focus here on something slightly different that I think helps explain some elements of these interactions. So as Clark and Fisher also noticed, there is great interpersonal variability when it comes to whether people engage emotionally with robots. They call some people players and some not players. So some people seem to engage in these interactions and some people just don't. I think this points to possible cultural and contextual elements, and I would say a little bit more about that. But there are also other aspects of this that are interesting. So subjects, for example, seem to switch in and out of the interaction with the depicted layer. So at times treat the robots in this affectively loaded or intentional stance-like way, and sometimes they don't. And participants in these studies mostly do not seem to ascribe abilities to the robots continuously, but rather to respond anthropomorphically to some aspects of their behavior. I think these elements point to the fact that some of our attributions of emotions to artificial agents reveal our reliance on normative expectations and scripts. And I think this has some consequences and some advantages. So I think looking at these interactions in these terms, and I will argue why, of course, means that we can shift the focus from the ability of the robot or artificial agent to the features of the situation. I think this is an advantage because it allows us to step away from the idea that what we have in our hands is a puzzle, something contradictory, because it is not really about what these robots can do, but it is about what the situation suggests us to do. There are other advantages to this. So explicit mental state attributions. So I guess explicit mentalizing or theory of mind does not need to be involved. And I will say a bit more about that too. And also emotion attributions and expectations on emotions, I think, are normatively regulated and contextual, and taking a script approach to this actually helps us see why. So when I talk about scripts, I refer to the Shank and Abelson classic definition, I guess, a structure that describes appropriate sequences of events in a particular context, a predetermined stereotyped sequence of actions that defines a well-known situation. So the classic example is the restaurant script, right? When we enter a restaurant, we don't really think about all of the actions that we're about to perform in order to get to the waiter, get to the table, open the menu, but we sort of have a script for how to behave, right? And the idea is that a lot of our social interactions are dominated by scripts. That's because scripts are helpful in helping us not overthink our social interactions too much. They make the cognitive load a little lighter. We can sort of go on an autopilot. But in the literature, several theorists have argued that this has a lot to do with norms as well. So Bichieri and McNally have argued that scripts form the backbone of our normative behavior because they entail normative expectations on how others should behave. So some scripts are not just about what it is expected to happen, but also what should happen for the interaction to go well. And when the scripts break down, we actually have reactions, emotional reactions towards them. The idea is that scripts get activated sort of automatically. So in a specific situation or when we interact with a specific kind of agent, the script sort of kicks in. And it entails not just actions, but also reactions. Of course, it's something dynamic. And several people in the literature, including me and Christina Musold, have underlined that script activation is also linked to activation of stereotypes. So we have scripts to interact with specific social agents, for example, but also that it facilitates social navigation, and it can provide application conditions for internalized norms. So norms that we might not be aware we are following, but we do follow. Not a lot of the script literature has engaged with the question whether our emotion attributions are scripted, but there has been a recent push to see affective aspects as also heavily influenced by scripts and other normative expectations. I'm referring here, of course, to the work of Elisa Filman-Barrett, not just in 2017, but across her production, who has stressed how emotion attributions are intimately tied to our social cultural experiences and conventions, and to the work of people like Ursula S. and Arley, where they have stressed how context plays an essential role in determining how we recognize emotion expressions. And what I've done in some work with Albert Niven is to push some of these claims a little further and claim that emotion attribution and recognition is heavily influenced by models that we have on situations, people, and social groups. And that our normative expectations on a social situation, including expectations on our own reactions, so not just the others, guide the way we interpret cues to attribute emotions. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the sort of data that we looked at. We don't have to be specific, but gender was brought up in the other talk too. So we know from several studies then the same facial expression is more likely to be interpreted as expressing anger if the target is masculine, and sadness if the target is feminine presenting. We know from other studies that the same emotional pose generated attribution of less fear and more anger for men, more fear and less anger for women. And that holds for androgynous faces as well, which are more likely to be classified as men if showing anger and as women if showing fear. And multiple people in the literature have pointed out that probably some of these attributions are modulated by stereotypes and behavioral norms that we have, expectations on the way different genders are allowed or expected to express emotions. Women are expected to experience sadness more than anger, for example. Other studies point also to other factors that might interfere, so to say, or modulate our emotional attributions. So Abramson and Petrenko have this great study where they show that complementary emotional reactions in interaction facilitate attribution. So when a target is interacting with another agent that is expressing fear, it is easier for us to recognize anger in the target and vice versa. That's because anger and fear are taught as complementary. If somebody is angry around you, probably somebody else is fearful and vice versa. Also, our judgments or expectations on whether or not the target is high status leads to easier anger attribution, according to one study. And other information about the person we have in front of us can determine how quick we are in, or how good we are in gauging intensity in emotions as well. These also holds for other situational factors. So it's not just the identity of the target in front of us, but this study by Chen and Whitney, for example, observed that subjects were able to track valence and arousal of characters in video clips rapidly, even when face and body clues were obscured. So basically, some situations sort of invite us to predict that the person in that situation is experiences certain emotions, even when we don't see the face of this person. And normally facial expression is our hallmark way to determine what somebody else is feeling. And also, and this is some of the most important, the most interesting work for me, display rules seem to make a difference too. So display rules show us that cross-culturally, different emotions are allowed or expected to be displayed publicly. This varies a lot across cultures. And some studies have found, for example, that Greek participants rated sad faces as more intensely sad, and German participants rated anger faces as more intensely angry, in line with cultural display rules. That's because sadness, it is a more acceptable emotion to display in public in Greek cultural environment. So at least that was the interpretation. What all of these studies, I think, show is that there are a variety of things that actually influence the way we recognize emotions in others, the factors that modulate our ability to identify correctly what the other is experiencing. And what I think is a take-home message from some of these, it is a feature of our emotional life. The norms, expectations, and context regulate the way we understand emotion expression cues and respond to them. And if we start thinking about our emotions as something that is regulated by our expectations or the way we respond to them, the way we recognize them, then I think a little mystery is left in why we end up experiencing emotional attribution to artificial agents, or being emotionally involved in some of these interactions, as this just piggybacks on our tendency to live, emote, and understand others' emotions in normatively and expectation regulated ways. So when it comes to our emotional attributions of emotional states, I think some of them are modulated by script activation. So if you remember the study I mentioned in the beginning, where people were playing with the dog, I think there is, with the robotic dog, I think there is good reasons to think that something like a playing with a dog script was activated that entailed expectations on how a dog, robotic or otherwise, would react to a ball being thrown and so on, and how to read the cues that were given by the robotic dog, like wagging a tail, for example. And that's because scripts invite us to fulfill behavioral and emotional expectations, but this has to do with the situation and the activated routinized behavior more than with our beliefs about the abilities of the dog. So it is not necessarily the case that these participants were thinking about the robotic dog as a real dog, but more that they were engaging in the playing with the dog script. And that determined their expectations on how to read the cues. I think these approaches also help us understand some of the things we have mentioned before. So people switch in and out of the interaction. I think that is because the script might not be activated, and scripts are finite. So there is a playing with the dog script, but once the play is over, and there's no reason to keep engaging with the robot in the same way. It might also help explain interpersonal variation. So there are cultural and social differences, as well as variability in how scripts can be triggered. Of course, not all of us are exposed and learn the same scripts for interactions because they are culturally determined. And also the fact that participants respond anthropomorphically to individual aspects of behavior of robots, that is likely to have to do with activation of scripts that call on different norms and expectations, but not so much with our judgment on what the robot can do. Another advantage, I think, is that scripts can potentially be activated by a variety of factors, including appearance or situational factors and other submentalizing processes. So we might want to look at what activates a script in particular. And the scripts also norm our own behavior and reactions. So it's not just that we expect other agents to behave in a certain way. We also are engaged in a way that we such that we expect ourselves to also respond in a certain way, or we think this is the correct way to respond. Another thing that this approach can do is, I think, opening good avenues for further explorations of what scripts get activated and how. There has been already some interesting work on this. So in a study by Fisher, for example, the user's very first spontaneous reaction to the greeting of a robot could predict how much they were going to see it as a social actor. So it seemed like a first contact, a first activation of a script in my vocabulary sort of determined how much was seen afterwards. But also there are things that modulate whether or not the participants are going to interact with the robot. So previous expectations are a big thing. So manipulating the expectations of the participants before interaction with the robot actually changed the way they interacted with it, which obviously makes sense, but also raises the question, which scripts will we want to be activated when interacting with robots? Should we consider these when we design them, and so on? So the upshot of this first part is that I think seeing emotion attribution as regulated by scripts and norms alerts us to how components of situations, as well as variety of inputs, modulate our emotion attributions. And to see our tendency to mentalize with artificial agents as a puzzle actually might lead us to overlook that we are just immersed in a network of norms, scripts, and expectations when it comes to the way we read affective cues and emotional context. Our emotional world is normatively regulated, modulated by expectations and situational factors, and our interactions with artificial agents, I think, just are showing us exactly that. And more in general terms, I think that paying attention to what influences our emotional attribution and involvement means also getting closer to determine how, in cases of imbalanced attributions, we need to intervene. And here I'm referring, for example, on the to the gender data. The fact that we read different facial cues differently depending on the person we have in front of us might generate situations that are maybe unjust or unbalanced, and we might want to pay attention to these attributions. Now, in the second part, I will talk about a different kind of technology. But before doing that, I would just want to make a brief note then I'm not making an appeal. I'm not trying to generate more panic. I'm using this nice image gotten from the London Tate Modern, this old pamphlet about a world turned upside down, the ridiculous, distracted times we live in, and so on. This was a very long time ago. I'm not trying to do that. I think there might be potential benefits for the technologies I'm talking about. I do think that we should be careful and mindful when we engage with them, though. This is just a little disclaimer. So I want to focus on technologies like chatbots for the second part of the talk, and in particular, things like Replica. Replica is this app used by a lot of people all over the world that is marketed as your AI friend. So a companion that always gives you empathy, that it's there for you in times of emotional need. As you can see from this post, some Reddit users say they get more empathy from AI than from their own family. So people do use this technology, right? And they use it to feel listened to. There is a lot of great research already on whether or not we can talk about empathy in these cases. Mostly the answers converge to no, this is not real empathy because the chatbot actually doesn't understand us. So there's something missing there. The chatbot cannot really mirror our emotions, so that's not possible either. And the chatbot doesn't care about us. Replica doesn't have motivational factors to actually take care of us. And I think these are all good answers to the question, but I want to focus on a slightly different question, which is what these interactions do to us and what are the effects of our use of this technology when we feel as users that we are receiving empathy. Whether or not that's true, it's another matter. So how does it change the way we see, understand, and construct ourselves, as I will elaborate on in a minute? So my answer to that will be that effectively loaded conversations, like the ones we have or some users have with chatbots, are ground for interpersonal inquiry and that they impact our self-knowledge. Perceived empathy from others, I argue, is a valuable feedback in our self-discovery and can be integrated in our self-narratives. And AI simulated empathy can constitute feedback integrated in our self-narrations, which should make us wary of some of its uses, I think. So, sorry, can you still hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my headphones were talking to me, speaking of technology, interfering. Okay, good. So one of the tools that I'm using to reach this conclusion is an inferentialist understanding of self-knowledge, and in particular of substantial self-knowledge. When I talk about substantial self-knowledge, I refer here to Kassam's idea. So the knowledge of our own character, values, and preferences, right? An inferentialist approach to substantial self-knowledge is an approach that argues that we know our mind at least partially, but crucially, on the basis of inference from behavioral and other evidence. So we collect evidence, and this helps us in a way to understand ourselves. And I couple this, I've argued in other parts, in other work, that this is a good idea, with an understanding of proper moral agency as entailing the ability to see ourselves from an allocentric perspective. So the ability of switching between a perspective on ourselves that is focused on how we see ourselves from the inside to seeing ourselves from the outside, from somebody else's perspective. Another tool in the belt is the idea of self-narratives. Self-narratives are a way to understand and experience our life. And I would argue part of the way we develop our self-knowledge. I rely here on a lot of different theorists in the last few decades that have argued for this claim. And they argue that self-narratives are diachronically stabilizing. So they allow us to recognize ourselves as the as connected to past iterations of ourselves and to future iterations. They sort of give us a stability to recognize ourselves across different situations. And they have to be understood, at least in most of the literature are understood this way, as socially built and co-narrated. So they develop in intrinsically social ways because we tell others our own stories, and the way we tell stories about ourselves is part of how we constitute the self as well. Moreover, I think conversations with others have a specific and special role to play for the constitution of these self-narratives. And I rely here on the idea of interpersonal inquiry in conversations by Dover, 2022. She argues that good conversations are conversations where we abdicate sovereignty. So we let the perspective of others inform us on how to interpret, understand, and report our stories. So the stories that have us as protagonists. She argues that if this is a good thing, we are vulnerable during meaningful conversations as we let others intervene and interpret and give us feedback on how we tell the self. Another way to say that is that these inquiries are related to acts of co-narration. So they are socially bound and embedded, as I mentioned before. And as I mentioned, and this is the last bit of the puzzle, I do think emotion expressions and attributions are regulated by norms and scripts. There are right and wrong ways to use emotions in our social interactions. And I think this is important because it has repercussions for how we narrate the emotions that we have during our self-narratives, as I will explain now. So in particular, I think a very important part of the way we narrate our stories is that empathy from others when we narrate functions as a precious pivotal feedback for the narratives. So when I tell a story to a friend about how I got angry because somebody wronged me, I expect my friend to be empathic, right? He's my friend. He's supposed to understand where I'm coming from and feel to some extent what I feel. If my friend is empathic, then I feel validated in my narration. But if my friend is not empathic, well, I might get angry, or I might be brought to just reevaluate my story, revise the way I tell it, think, okay, maybe anger was not the right reaction. I guess maybe I should be feeling something else. What I'm getting at is that expressions of empathy can validate our stories or gently invite us to revise them, right? In the best cases. So they are a part of the way we re-elaborate on what we say. And I think we use the reactions that others have to scaffold our re-elaboration and comprehension of our self-narratives in light of what I've been saying so far. Importantly, I think some of this re-elaboration doesn't have to be with other humans. And I think there is some evidence that sometimes some of the users of these technologies do use them to re-elaborate and reflect on our self-narratives and to change them, possibly too. Consider this quote from this study by Maples and colleagues. Answering my replicas questions about me doing my daily reflection and seeing the notes he makes about me in his diary allows me to see who I am from another perspective. I can see where I'm struggling and how I can work on those things. I think this is a good example of the sort of re-elaboration I'm getting at. The user is using the feedback from the chatbot and also the notes that the chatbot is taking, so to say, to reflect on the story, to reflect on the episodes. Feedback from others, I think, transforms the way we narrate events, and empathic expressions in particular and emotion validation are an important part of this feedback. And I think in some cases, the dialogical exchange with the chatbot can function as a sounding board for our narratives. It gives them structure, validation, maybe verbal confirmation. I'm assuming just the act of typing out our story can have some consequences on how we are elaborating it, right? But if this is correct, then it means that after interactions, being them with other humans, or in some cases with chatbots, for example, our anger, anger might feel validated or, on the contrary, dismissed, but our rendition of the event might be subjected to change, determining how we use it in our future self-narratives. So feeling validated in our affective reactions constitute the feedback to our stories and expressions, and can be incorporated in our future self-narrations. Now, this has a dark side, right? And it doesn't have to be related to chatbot use. But in general, if it is a good thing that we are vulnerable to others, that we let others intervene on our self-narratives, we let their empathy inform us or validate our feelings and so on, and Dover thinks that this is indeed good, there are obvious possible risks that come with that, right? So Werner has talked about narrative deference, so the excessive dependence on others' interpretations of our for our narratives. I think it's probably happened to anybody to realize we are too dependent on somebody else's opinion on our stories at times. In extreme cases, this can lead to forms of what Fabry calls narrative gaslighting, right? So the idea is somebody else might actually intentionally be messing up with our self-narratives by giving us feedback in one way or the other. I don't think this is necessarily a risk when we talk about AI, because depending on your understanding of what gaslighting is, you might actually think gaslighting needs an intention to harm, for example. But it points to the fact that some of this interference of others is independent of our consent to be involved in co-narration. So it depends on the vulnerability that characterizes deep, meaningful conversations. And the point is that if users of Replika use Replika to have this emotional support, they are likely to have these emotionally loaded conversations, right? And I think this points to some specific risks that we should probably pay attention to. So when we use Replika, for example, we ask for feedback. iReplika asks for feedback on its responses, and we sort of train it to give us the right kind of feedback, what we want. So we can upvote and downvote the responses that Replika gives. And of course, Replika is a product, right? So it's something that people pay for, and they need to keep paying for. So they need to enjoy the experience, so to say. And so while we also give feedback to our friends, right? And we can push back against our friends' renditions or understanding of our narratives, our friends can react to us in return. They can respond to us. They are subjected to reason responsiveness, right? So if I tell a story to a friend and they're not empathetic with me, I might protest, but they might push back. They might say, no, you want me to say that you were right, but you just weren't. And this can maybe change our relationship, but it is a possibility, right? Here we are, when it comes to Replika and other chatbots, we're exposed to something a little bit different. So because of the absence of this reason responsiveness, right? So maybe we should pay attention to that. In particular, I think we do learn things about ourselves when friends do not agree or empathize with us. Of course, we might just learn we have bad friends, but I think in other cases we just learn about our own reactions, about how others are, right? And so a question I think it's worth asking is if we learn about ourselves as much when we can dismiss this affective feedback in the way we do with Replika. So what does that imply? And should we maybe at least consider designing the apps a little bit differently? If we take proper agency, as I do, to demand this interplay between an allocentric perspective and an egocentric one, then the question becomes, what if these apps never give us a reason to push back, right? What if our stories get validated all the time? Is that always good, right? Is receiving empathy in some cases always the best thing that can happen to us for our self-narrations and so on? Is that the best form of feedback? Maybe it is, but I think it's worth asking the question. So the upshot here is that I think receiving empathy is a central form of feedback towards our stories and our emotional reactions. And as such, it has the potential to be incorporated in our narration as a role in our self knowledge. And that conversations with AI can be important moments for these elaborations because AI might change the social cultural conditions that allow for our self narratives by including new forms of feedback in the form of perceived empathy. Again, it might not be real empathy, but that might not matter. So I talked about very different technologies, social robots on one side and chatbot on the other side. I do think both both these trends though point to something similar, which is that giving empathy and reading others' emotions and receiving empathies are norm-regulated activities. They do enrich our social interactions, but have also a lot to do with our expectations from others, with the way we relate to each other as social agents, and so on. And I think looking at limit cases like interactions with artificial agents can help us identify some of the features of our empathy practices, how situational and contextual cues impact them, and analyze further their functions in our moral and social life. And I think that's worth exploring more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was such a thought-provoking talk. We've hosted some conversations in empathy and AI here at Penn State last year, and I think the different ways we think about empathy in the context of these evolving new technologies is an ever fascinating set of questions. Yeah, and I was really interested. I mean, especially in addition to the fact that I liked how you were appealing to some constructionist theories of emotion and some of the work done by colleagues here like Reg Adams and Alicia Grandy with cue perception and display rules and that sort of thing. One of our later speakers in the series, Simone Chimay-Sori, has some great work on adaptive empathy and how we learn from our own empathizing with other people in it through interactions. And that aspect of what you're talking about here, I think, is really intriguing. Um, Yeah, I guess if folks have questions, do drop them in. I think one question that I have that sort of dovetails your talk and Philip's talk as well. I was trying to think of cross-cutting themes, and I really liked the point early on about the variability across situations in terms of how we switch in and switch out. So how do we use emotion regulation to engage and disengage or connect or disconnect, as Philip put it earlier? And I mean, you would appeal to things like first greeting and previous expectations. And I guess I'm just curious if there are other factors you think that could play a role in terms of either speculatively or from other research that you're aware of that could play a role in decisions to engage or disengage across situations with these different kinds of agents.
Yeah, I think so. Physical appearance is probably something. So some of our studies, so we did some studies on perspective taking, but it was visual perspective taking. So back a couple of levels when it comes to complexity and components. But so we know the visual appearance, for example, modulates how likely we are to spontaneously take the perspective of a robot, for example, right? So that has the very concrete chance to actually influence other processes because we are more likely, for example, to trigger a specific script or trigger specific expectations if we, I don't know, see a robot as a waiter robot, for example, and engage in that sort of script. So that would be one of the things that I think would make a difference. And there is some evidence already towards that. I think cross-cultural variation is also going to be a very big thing, right? So there are cultures that are also more familiar with robotic agents than ours, for example. I don't know if Philip has thought.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one like familiarity might also be a big thing. It relates to what you said about these cross-cultural things. It's kind of thinking that further. And And thinking a little bit further from what you said in the last part of the talk, I found that super interesting. The idea that these artificial agents that might help us to reflect on our own narratives and stories and so on. If these are paid services and they want us to keep doing it, how critical can it be? How can it actually help? And I need a lot of meta knowledge about whether something is really, the right level of criticism for me, or if I just want to, perpetuate the story I already have with the comments I get and so on. So I thought, that could also be a disconnecting factor. I disconnect from the agent that's supposed to help me once it's becoming too critical, too unempathetic towards me. But it might actually be the right thing to, if I were in psychotherapy, I'm working as a psychotherapist also, it might also, be really the thing to do in order to help me understand the next step. And anyway, so the disconnection might also be sometimes a really good thing for a certain amount of time. Just
I think another point of connection of technology. After 5 years, I still do that all the time. Between your two talks, I mean, I liked in your talk, Philip, the curvilinear, the quadratic trends with stress and disconnection and the implications of managing one's over arousal and how to regulate one's emotions, especially empathy, without getting overwhelmed in a way that's problematic. Trying to think about integrating that with Leda's talk. And the use of scripts is often discussed as a way to ease certain kinds of social interactions. I know there was an article in the New York Times recently about how in medical care, doctors often use scripts in order to simplify and ease the emotional and cognitive burden of care. And this author, Reisman, talked about how uh, if we're already using scripts to manage emotions in difficult, challenging care situations, he was questioning, well, why should we be concerned if AI also generates scripts that are also useful and helpful, of course, when well calibrated, but they could be useful for managing these challenging situations. And I guess my question is like thinking about how to use these human AI interactions to modulate the quadratic relationship of stress and disconnection that you were mentioning in your talk, Philip. So using these human AI interactions, I think like Leda, I've been really interested in how to use them to facilitate, make empathy easier to manage, to balance the costs and the risks and the stress in potentially creative ways. So I'd just be curious if either of you have thoughts or the connections between those two.
Really interesting thought, and I haven't thought in that direction yet. So my thinking has so far always gone in the direction of helping people to generate, maybe in addition to being negatively affected by the suffering they're confronted with, to help them generate in addition these positive emotions of care and concern and compassion, kindness, and so on. Because what that does is basically it doesn't necessarily downregulate the negative emotion, but it adds this positive component that soothes and downregulates sympathetic activity and so on. So and the nice thing about it is also that it can keep you real in that sense, you're still you, and in that situation really there you're not automatized following a script or something like that. So I'm exaggerating a little bit. So yeah, and so I think it's interesting to think about agents and how they could help us, but maybe they could take the edge off at some points also, and because there are these situations where even trained people are overwhelmed, right? And maybe particularly in those situations, it could be a helpful tool. I don't know. Later, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought. And I was thinking about it because yeah, that's why I had, my little note on like no panic. I think we can do good things probably. We just have to think about it a little bit. And there are some some users, so I did dig into Reddit a little bit, right, to understand how people use these technologies. And there are some people that say it just made me more empathetic because I had somebody, like I had, this validation and this support all the time. And I started modeling after that, just like trying to be always ready to provide that sort of feedback. And this is a possible way, I think, to think about that. But while you were talking, I was thinking exactly about that. So empathy fatigue, for example, for doctors, or cases in which it might not be possible or even appropriate for a person to keep reinforcing and to keep listening and to keep validating, but some support might be used some other way. So perhaps something like that, paying attention to the fact that there might be other risks there, right? And one thing I've been thinking about lately is whether this is just a matter of sort of percentage. So the Maple study, for example, show that people are more likely to use these people using these. So they did a study on a campus, and users of these technologies had good social support, but they were more likely than non-users to be described as lonely, which made me think, okay, so this is one of the reasons why we should care, right? Because that loneliness might be a vulnerability. At the same time, maybe this gives us another perspective, right? Maybe it's okay that we have one outlet for our emotions where we always are told that we are right, as long as we have other people giving us feedback that maybe don't do the same, right? Maybe having some of that feedback can be good for us and can make us feel better and validated, but at the same time, if it's mixed in with other kinds of feedback, with other kinds of emotional interactions, that it can be good. Maybe the problem is when it is the only outlet, when it's the only way of validating our self narratives. So it might just be a matter of quantity, in a sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have one more thought here, because maybe a good metaphor could be also that it's a bit something like crutches, So when you have
Yeah.
difficulty starting to connect to other people, starting to walk, it's good to take some steps, and sometimes people are being recommended to get a dog or so, to start connecting to another being. And similarly, and a bit more complex, you could also start connecting to an agent and use it as a crutch to help you as a later goal to be able to connect to other people also more.
That's a great way to put what I was thinking about before. Maybe just for situations in which it's impossible otherwise, like a little bit of scaffolding towards then forming the real connections that everybody deserves. Yeah.
So there are two questions that build directly off of this. I do want to, at some point, I really do want to ask. I'll get to it. There's a question. I'm really curious how you think about this with what this tells us for empathy more broadly, and I really like your framing of that and just how we think about whether this is a unique case or actually an extension of what we already do. But I'll come back to that because there's a couple questions that build more directly off what you and Philip are saying. One of my colleagues here in the business school, Dani Yin, who herself does some really great work on feeling heard and perceptions of empathy from AI. So she says that she likes the self-narrative perspective on the receiving end of empathy. Um, on the other hand, some people may turn to AI to seek a sense of being cared for. In the long term, they may know it's not real. She wonders about diversions and motivations for going to AI for empathy. So in some cases, like what you're describing, perhaps seeking insights, clarity, understanding of self, AI empathy could be very helpful. But for those who want authentic being cared for, it may backfire, especially in the long term. Because if we see, for example, if there's any research that finds that AI companion use can causally lead to loneliness in the long term. So different motivations, self-insight versus authentic relational connection, perhaps.
Yeah. I think that sounds right, actually. And this is why So a lot of these chatbots have these like disclaimer while you use them, apparently. So they say like something like this is just an AI or like this is not real or so trying to signal is I think it was a result of some um, you know, request or like a legal disclaimer requirement or whatever. They say like this is not a real conversation. This is not a real person you're talking to. It doesn't seem to change that much how people interact with it, as far as I know. I might be wrong with it about it, um, but I think this question is very important because it points to exactly this difference between trying to use this as possible um, re-elaboration tool in a way that is aware of its limitations, but also sort of compartmentalized, right? So this is my elaboration tool now, and then maybe I go talk to somebody else, or maybe I do other things. And this other risk, which is more sneakier. And okay, so one thing I do think is relevant and maybe should be said up front is that I think it would be a mistake to try and solve a social problem, which is the fact that some people are lonely and need to be cared for with a technological patch. And I think that this might be pointing to that. I think people that seek being cared for, they should just be provided the care. And so maybe we should be mindful of exactly that. Like, why do people engage with this? And if it's just to re-elaborate and once in a while spell out your own thoughts without having to do it with another human being, that sounds nice. But if you're looking for care, maybe we should look at other solutions, if that makes sense.
And I think that connects to Brianna's question, one of our current students, who was just asking about help with mental health in terms of thinking about not just seeking out mental health, but also balancing things like environmental impact, given what we're learning about the climate impacts of using AI for queries, like how to balance those considerations in your mind.
A great question. Yeah, so there are, so I should say, there are good, no, I'm sorry, I got distracted. Yes, I could make a few more minutes if Philip's is okay. Now there are good new articles about it. So Sarif Terkin has a new article on chatbots and therapy specifically. I haven't looked in that specific realm too much, but I think a lot of people are starting to think it can be exactly like Philip was saying, sort of crutches, sort of like an additional support, but something that maybe we shouldn't exclusively rely on. I do personally think the question you're asking about environmental um, effects is it's one we should be asking more in general when we use things like ChatGPT or anything AI, because the environmental costs are very high and we tend to not see them because of how easy these resources are accessible. So to assess them, yeah, I think it's a great question to which I don't have a great answer, but exactly the right question to ask. So
So here's a question that integrates. It's an earlier question that was actually asked of Philip's talk, but I'm curious, there might be a way to pitch it to both of you. So Daniel asked about perspective taking for self and others, and different, what I'm interpreting as meaning different kinds of perspective taking. We know about imagined self perspective taking, where you put yourself in someone else's shoes versus trying to really imagine another person's perspective from their own vantage point. And so this person asked if distinct types of theory of mind practice show any differences in the work here. And so I'm curious, I guess in terms of your own work, Philip, in terms of different kinds of perspective taking you've thought about or examined, but also Leda, like if the different kinds of perspective that one could afford through AI interaction, you could imagine versions of it where a user could be approaching it through a more egoistic, self-interested perspective versus using it in a way to really try to understand from a third party that's not one's own starting point? What kind of advice could I seek? So I'm just kind of curious, like from each of your lines of research, how do you think about different kinds of perspective taking?
Yeah, it's a really cool question. So conceptually, I think it should be quite related because both lead to abstract propositional knowledge about mental states, be it your own states or other states. And there is actually also some evidence for it, thinking about your own states or other states, activating some parts of the networks are overlapping and so on. And an interesting thing that I can say from the intervention study that we did is that the exercises were mixed in a way. And one exercise that they did, this dyadic exercise, it went that way that you were in a training session developing or exploring inner models, basically. So it comes a little bit from inner family systems therapy. So with the idea that you have like an inner caretaker, for instance, and an inner child, and I don't know, everybody has different parts, so you can explore these. It's just a model, of course, but the idea was to see whether, over the 3 months that people did this, um, whether working with these models would change how they are able to take perspective. So what they did is I don't know, in the beginning you have 5 different inner models, for instance, and the computer tells you what perspective to take. So for instance, I'm told to talk about this talk that I had to give from the perspective of the inner child. And then I would take that perspective and tell my partner about the situation from that perspective, and the partner guesses the perspective. So that is the perspective taking of another person. But I kind of take different perspectives of myself. And what we found is that the increase in theory of mind performance in this task, independent task, correlated with the number of inner parts that people found or explored or developed kind of models of throughout these 3 months. So the more fine-grained, basically, your inner models or of the range of your inner states is, the better you are in taking perspective on other people. So it's a relatively strong argument, I would say, for them being quite related, self and other perspective taking. And then there are, of course, also differences. So when you look more at this really metacognition on monitoring your own performance, for instance, or so you see also different activation patterns sometimes for this kind of thing. Yeah. And also the training, if you think about mentalization-based therapy, for instance, it would help both understanding your own, being able to label your own states and other states. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I think that is great. I might send you an email asking you for that paper.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I love that there's this correlation between taking different inner perspectives and being able to take the perspective of others. That's really
And it's
great.
actually also a little bit related, I think, to the idea of emotional granularity, that Lisa Feldman-Barrett always puts forward, that the more concepts of emotions you have, the better you can also live or regulate maybe manage your own emotional states. And similarly, for a more cognitive domain, having this bigger range of inner models helps you to understand your behavior. It's maybe actually quite related also to your concept of the scripts in a way, and narratives.
No, this is really great. That sounds fascinating. Yeah, and I mean, I like how this also ties with this idea that McGear develops, and that this idea of self-knowledge and being related to knowledge of others, and really how others see you in a sense. So that to actually achieve a good understanding of who you are, you're supposed to be able to see things from different angles, and that makes you a better moral agent as well, because you are not supposed to look at yourself just from the outside, but also being able to look from the outside, but also you shouldn't only see yourself as the object from the outside, right? Because McGeer would say that that leads to alienation. So not being able to see yourself as you. So I really like how that also seems to be related to just developing better skills at seeing others. This idea of just having a multiplicity to handle. That's really great. Yeah, like that. I actually, can I ask a quick follow-up? I mean, it's actually related to Philip's talk in general, but I feel like so I love the talk, and there were so many interesting things about it. One of my first questions, as somebody that has done a little bit of um, development of theory of mind, so trying to ask what brings to development, and how do we learn to actually read other people's mind as children and so on. I was wondering if you have thoughts at this point about this relationship between the ability to take the perspective of others and the ability to empathize. If you have thoughts on how in development of children, so in ontogeny, how the two relate, how they follow, what consequences that has for this idea that you can approach others and understand others from different angles, so to say. I don't know if the question is clear, but any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, so I think what one can say is that the what's sometimes called the little sister of empathy, emotional contagion,
Mm.
that is something that is soon there, right? So one baby crying makes another baby cry, for instance, or laughing also, that there's contagious laughing. So they are affected by other
Mm-hmm.
babies or other people's emotions quite soon, and probably before they can, or certainly before they can take others' perspective on a willful, voluntary level. So, but it lacks the capacity to, probably it lacks the capacity to differentiate the source of the effect, right? So, if you look at the definition I mostly use by Frédéric de Vignemont and Singer, where they say that empathy, it would include the knowledge that the source of the emotion is the other, not you. So this self-other distinction, basically. And
Mm-hmm.
whether babies have this right after birth is questionable. At least it's hard to test, really. Also in adults, it's difficult to test, kind of. But
Yeah.
anyways, and there's some ideas that this might be a connecting point also for theory of mind, that the self-other distinction, that is something that it's a kind
Yeah.
of a common component. And once it develops, you can also develop this more elaborate forms of emotion sharing that include self-other distinction and also perspective taking. Um, and yeah, but more simplistic forms of perspective taking, like really just gaze following, even though this kind of thing, that implicit perspective taking, that might also develop earlier. I think the literature is a little bit shaky on that, but
Yeah.
it seems to be there. There's a really nice paper by Francesca HP and colleagues,
Mm.
where they also, kind of think through how common components and so on. It's more speculation, or not a speculation, like a conceptual paper. We still don't have the data for that, but how these components, maybe of social cognition, are sometimes joined, and then how things co-develop, basically, like this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah. And so there's yeah, I feel like
Mm.
we could keep the conversation going for hours, I'm sure. I mean, at some point, Philip, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on I loved that I mentioned earlier the diversity within your empathy stimulus set of different kinds of situations that a priori seem to present different kinds of challenges, like political conflict and disasters and relational betrayals. That was really fascinating. I'd be curious to hear more about anything you see in like the variability across kinds of empathic. Another part of the point was to look at the generalizability across the stimulus set, but if there was interesting variability across different items. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think, in closing, I guess I mean, from my perspective, I mean, it's interesting to think about how we define empathy, and there's so many debate. We've heard it today, like how do we come to a resolution on what empathy is and demarcate different components and understand how it manifests, across people or within a given person across situations. Um, I think one last broader question, I guess two last questions, 'cause I don't see any more in the chat. Um, for your talk, Leda, one thing I wanted to ask too was just in terms of, I feel like when I do empathy AI research or read about it, either in science or ethics or just in popular culture, there's often this question about like, what does this tell us about human empathy? Like, what is studying this specific sort of case for one particular kind of target referent? How does that tell us about how empathy works more generally, whatever we mean by the term empathy? And I guess I thought it was interesting that it really you sort of deconstructed the question, I think, in an interesting way by appealing to like what are the features that we already think do that are common in how we empathize across the two kinds of situations with human and artificial agents. And I guess I was curious if you have any further thoughts about what you think this tells us. What you think, and I know you're studying empathy with different kinds of targets, not just robotic agents or AI, but what do you think that work could stand to tell us about how human empathy works more generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so that's right. I think you characterized it exactly right. So I tend to think um, it's not we tend to treat these cases as these special cases, and really, to me, makes more sense to see them as just another facet of what we already do, and just with other application conditions. Um, I think, I think, for example, the case of, well, actually both cases, but especially the chatbot case, it just points to the fact that there is a lot um, of relational and like sort of in progress components that it's worth looking at. So empathy is to be understood as something that unfolds in a certain way in a situation, and something that we react to as well. It's not just about that moment, so to say, but it's more about interlocking actions and reactions. It's something that builds up over time. It's something that is socially bound in multiple ways. It's not just about us being a social brain and relating to others, but it's also rooted in practices. There are like ways to express empathy and to respond to expressions of empathy that are culturally dominated, that are determined by what our norms are, and so on. And I think a lot of research already points to that, but I think it is like still a message to bring home. This is why I liked the fact that Philip started his talk with the network view, right? What happens when um, depression spreads, like with bad feelings actually go through the network, because really, I think a message of this is that it's always about a whole interaction. It's not just about that moment of mirroring an emotion. A lot of examples when in emotion recognition, it's unavoidable, right? So a lot of emotion recognition research is about the static image with a frowny face and whether or not we see that as a sadness. But emotions are more complicated than that, and they are situated, and our empathy is also situated in that way, and I think these cases show us exactly that.
Yeah. I think it's also one thing I like about both of your talks is that I mean, in some ways, when we talk big picture about empathy and interaction or empathy and AI, I feel like sometimes people can have very wide varying assumptions about what exactly it is we're talking about. And I like how in both of your cases, going with more granular, specific components, whether that be subcomponents of empathy and theory of mind and compassion, and then particular situational features, or in your case with scripts across situations. mean, I feel like sometimes there seems to be a sort of a kind of essentialism in how we talk about empathy and a big picture view that doesn't always get into those finer details. And I think if, as you know, having written about AI and empathy, like I feel like it sometimes if we try to dig deeper and go more specific and understand that if empathy is if certain components of empathy are tracking scripted expectations across situations, you know, if someone's trying to use those interactions to promote self-development in a way that's not unlike what we would see in the human to human case, I think there's something interestingly empathetic about trying to kind of understand that process over time in the way you're talking about. Um,
I
so I know,
like that.
yeah, and I know we're a bit over time, so I don't want to keep you much longer. Um, Do any of you have any other final thoughts? I mean, your session is really the kickoff for this year in terms of thinking about what empathy is and trying to parse it and think about its complexities in real life. If you have any final things you think are interesting to think about for the field moving forward, or last points you would want to make before we close for the day, I'd love to turn it over to you to close it out.
Maybe just one more thought that came up also right now when you two spoke. Um, we define empathy a lot as an emotion or a capacity in one brain, but it really may be much more interactional, and develop and be something that is there because of several people, or at least two people, and why not also then, if one of the people is an artificial agent, but still expresses something that is experienced by the other person also as showing empathy. Why not use the term then too there? And yeah, I think that is something that, because it's difficult to study, I mean, the literature hasn't really done so much to look at these aspects that are beyond the individual, but they are super crucial, I think, and uh, part of what we want to do now. Actually, you mentioned the ERC project, and that's actually part of that project to move a little bit to an interactive setting and kind of see how emotions drive each other, for instance, in an interaction, and something emerges that wouldn't emerge if you just, the typical studies, it's like watching TV, and you, of course, you can feel emotions, but it's a very different thing if the other receives your reaction as well, and you know about this and so on. Yeah. So the interactionality of that phenomenon is a super interesting thing to me, and I think that there's a lot going on also when you interact with an artificial agent, interestingly.
No, I like that as a closure. I like this idea of empathy as a process, so to say. So more than one, or mirroring moment. And I think, Philip's take was great. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both for a wonderful discussion this afternoon. I think it's a great way to kick off the series, and I appreciate you staying up despite the time difference and everything. But yeah, next we're going to continue some of these themes in the next couple of weeks. So next Wednesday, the 14th, we have Sarah Conrath and Fritz Breithaupt who are talking about positive and negative takes on empathy and how it can grow across time and the biases it can have and what those might be, to what extent they exist, and so forth. And then the final week on the 21st, we have the philosopher Valerie Tiberius talking about value fulfillment and learning. And we also have Simone Chimay-Sori who will talk about adaptive empathy and how we learn from our interactions, empathizing with others in this dyadic way. So thank you both very much for a wonderful conversation. I look forward to continuing this going into the future. And thanks again, y'all, for attending.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
great.
It was really a pleasure to be here and discuss with you too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Talk more soon. Bye.
Bye.